Why do we see aging as something that just is?
That's a very good question. It's one that I have been struggling with for 30 years. Um, ever since I discovered that my first wife thought that way. Um, she was a biologist. She's the reason why I got into biology. And, she was a lot older than me. She was a senior professor in California at the time. And it was a complete bombshell to me that she didn't regard aging as her problem. I think the only way to explain it is that it's a psychological coping mechanism. That we know that aging is absolutely ghastly, and we've known this since the beginning of civilization, and we've just had to find ways to put it out of our minds since we could not do anything about it. So we make up fairy stories that either aging is a blessing in disguise for some reason, like, where will we put all the people, or how will we pay the pensions, or wouldn't dictators live forever, or doesn't death give meaning to life, things like that. Um, or alternatively, as you say, we just view it as woven into the fabric of the universe and somehow intrinsically off limits to medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to ask somebody what aging is, they would just assume or they would just say, okay, that's synonymous with getting older. But
Right.
I mean, there's obviously a lot to unpack there to actually understand what aging is. How do you define what it means?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, aging is actually not hard to define at all. And so that's another real paradox that, we've not come up with an agreed definition that we all use. Because aging of the human body or of any living organism is actually just the same thing as aging of a simple man made machine. The machine, any machine with moving parts, does itself damage, continuously as a consequence of its normal operation, and the machine is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage without any significant decline in function, but only a certain amount, and eventually that amount is exceeded, and function starts to decline and eventually cease entirely. So in a car, rust accumulates, contamination in the oil, whatever, and eventually the doors fall off. And of course, we know how to stop that from happening. We know that if we do nicely comprehensive preventative maintenance, the car lasts longer. And indeed, that if we do sufficiently comprehensive preventative maintenance, then the car lasts forever. That's why we have 100-year-old cars now that are working every bit as well as the day they were built. Even though they were never built to last 100 years, they were built to last maybe 10 years. But preventative maintenance just transcends any kind of warranty period that the machine has. And it's exactly the same for the human body. Of course, the human body is a really, really, really complicated machine. And it is one that we did not design. And therefore, there are lots of things that we don't know, don't understand about how the machine works. But it's still a machine. Its function is determined by its structure. And therefore, preventative maintenance will also work. You just have to get good at it.
Would you say that your view of aging and the human body, and I find that analogy with the 100-year-old car really interesting. I mean, would you say your view of aging in the human body is purely mechanistic, or is there any type of intangible factor here that you think that, science can't quite capture?
Oh, well, there's definitely no intangible aspect of the human body. Now, I'm not talking about the human being, I'm not making any claims
Yeah.
as to whether there is any kind of soul or, non physical aspect of being a person, but we're talking about the body. And we know that, whatever intangible things might exist, they are, if you like, trapped within the body for as long as the body keeps working. So the body is what matters here.
So your work, like what I think could be really helpful for people here, because this is like very forward thinking in terms of aging, like within the medical system or the health and wellness space, like looking to the past, are there things that we see as very common and we just take as natural that used to be very taboo or seen as crazy? Like, is there like something there that could really, I guess, just frame it better for people?
Other kind of precedent. Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, cancer is actually a pretty good one. People, view cancer as a disease that it is appropriate to try to find cures for, and so they should, because it is actually, something we don't like to have happen to us, and medicine is capable of doing something about it. But 100 years ago, cancer was something that one didn't really talk about. It wasn't. It was considered so. You know, uh, beyond the reach of medicine that it was just scary, and people just preferred to put it out of their minds. So I think the fact that we have put that attitude aside and started to treat cancer like in a grown up way is a pretty good precedent.
So, within your personal experiences of getting within this work, I know this wasn't directly what you had set your life on. You started in artificial intelligence research and then transitioned more so into this scientific biological space. Can you just talk more about how that transition transpired?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I went to do AI research as a youngster, and did my undergraduate degree in computer science and all that. Basically, because I had realized at a very young age, like 8 or 9 years old, excuse me, that what I wanted to do with my life was to make a difference to the world, and that meant working on the most important problems for the world. And when I was 15, I started programming, found I was good at it. So I thought, right, well, the um, best way for me to make a difference is to address the problem of work. The fact that people have to spend so much of their time doing stuff that they would not do unless they were being paid for it. In other words, we need more automation. So that's why I went into that area. But I always knew that aging was by far the biggest problem, was a far bigger problem than the problem of work. It's just that I didn't have any particular reason to believe that I would be an exceptionally good biologist. And so I thought, I'll leave that to the people who are. And the thing is, I never did the experiment of actually raising the topic with anybody and discovering that actually almost everybody views aging, as you mentioned earlier on, as this kind of thing that's not their problem. And so it was only when I accidentally realized that after being married to a biologist for a couple of years that it then took another couple of years actually until about 1995 for me to really come to terms with it. But yeah, eventually I decided, well, I've got no choice here. I've got to switch fields. And I had done pretty well in my several years of AI research. So I had convinced myself that I'm pretty good at working on really hard problems. So I thought, well, maybe I've got a chance of making a contribution.
So, what did those first few years look like when you really sunk into this?
Well, the first 5 years were nothing particularly extraordinary. They were basically me just learning the field, doing a lot of reading, spending a lot of time in libraries, actually reading papers, and also, of course, going to conferences. I had a job that was paying the bills well enough so that I could pay my way to conferences. Of course, I wasn't being invited to speak back then. Um, and so I was getting to know all the top people in the field and to know the field well. And I did publish a few papers during that period that were quite well received, actually. Even though I had no formal training, as how to work a pipette or run a gel or anything like that, uh, nevertheless, people viewed me adequately. And yeah, the first 5 years was just pretty much me getting to grips with the question. And then, of course, in the year 2000, I had this eureka moment of what everybody was missing.
Did you have any formal mentors, or do you feel like you were really the one just leading the charge on your own?
No, I didn't have any formal mentors. I had given up biology in terms of formal education at the age of 15, and I learned a lot of biology through my wife, as I mentioned, just over the dinner table, asking her, what did you do today, dear? And that worked pretty well, but there were large swathes of biology that my wife didn't know anything about. She was a geneticist. She didn't know any biochemistry. Um, but it turns out biochemistry is actually a really easy thing to teach yourself from books. So yeah, I basically, I was for the parts of biology that I didn't get over the dinner table, I got it in libraries, and that was how I got going. And I think that was quite important because there's a distinguished history of people making significant contributions in fields when they switch fields. Because they're
Mm,
kind of not encumbered by the conventional wisdom. The most
mm.
famous example is that the whole of molecular biology was invented by a bunch of physicists back in the 1950s.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It takes an outsider's perspective to truly create innovation because you don't have that framing of an industry. Yeah, that's really cool. So you've created a few foundations, and your most recent one you created a few years back, Longevity Escape Velocity. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so the term longevity escape velocity is one that I coined about 20 odd years ago. And it's a term that's based on the essence of how I believe we are going to bring aging under comprehensive medical control. Specifically, that we're going to do it by not slowing aging down, but by actually reversing it, turning the clock back and making people biologically younger again. Now, the reason that matters is, of course, it's much better in terms of its impact because you can take people who are already in middle age or older and actually, do something good. Whereas if you're only slowing aging down, then they're going to just, stay old. Um, uh, but also, it means we buy time. If you take someone who's, let's say, 60 and you rejuvenate them so that they're biologically 40, then you've got 20 years before they become biologically 60 again. Now, when they do become biologically 60 again, in terms of the amount of damage in their body, um, it'll actually be harder because the damage will be kind of enriched for the difficult damage that your treatments from 20 years ago didn't work on. But um, those 20 years will have been enough time for biologists to figure out what to do next so that we will be able to rejuvenate the same people, even though the damage that's in their body is more difficult intrinsically. Um, and we'll carry on doing that over and over again. So the idea is that longevity escape velocity is the minimum rate at which scientists will need to improve the comprehensiveness of these rejuvenation treatments so as to stay one step ahead of the problem. In other words, so that the same people, so long as they're receiving state-of-the-art treatments at any time, will not be getting biologically older, even though they are, of course, getting chronologically older.
I want to get more so into the specifics of that work and how that actually plays out. But before that, I want to talk about the structure of your foundation because I think it's really important for the conversation here. And especially going from what you were saying earlier about, kind of being an outsider coming into the space. So I read your bio and it said that you consider yourself to be a born heretic. And I found that really fascinating. Can you talk about, I guess, your personal makeup as a person and how that aligns with the structure of the foundation and why that's so important for the work that you do?
Yeah, so I guess that's true. I do consider myself a professional heretic. I guess I've always recognized that if you're not pissing anybody off, then you're probably not making much of a difference. And I have, I guess, a healthy disrespect for authority, so I don't have much trouble, thinking, in an unorthodox way, which, as you say, is completely necessary for making pioneering technological progress or indeed scientific progress. Um, I guess there is a linkage with the structure of my organization and indeed the structure of the previous two organizations that I led, the Methuselah Foundation and Sense Research Foundation. In all three cases, these are non-profits, so they're not beholden to people who want to make money. And they're also funded entirely or almost entirely by philanthropy, as opposed to government grants or anything. So that means that they are not subject to the strictures that come with trying to get money from the government, which essentially revolves around peer review. In other words, you basically only get money if you can convince your colleagues in advance that what you want to do with that money is sensible. And that's kind of, as far as I'm concerned, that's the by far the biggest catastrophe that has happened in science this millennium. It's like completely antithetical to the way that science ought to be done. Um, but it's the way that science is done, and so I had to work outside of that framework in order to do things that were, ahead of their time.
From a money perspective, you've talked about that breakdown exactly between investors versus donors. Do you think there are more people inserting themselves into this space strictly from an ROI perspective compared to a humanitarian perspective?
Oh, for sure, and I don't see anything wrong with that either. I think um, well, I mean, putting it bluntly, investors tend to write bigger checks than donors do, so the work goes faster. Um, And, until maybe 10 years ago, there was basically no private sector at all in this field. Everything was being done in either academia or, a few people like me doing, the philanthropic approach. But now that there is a private sector, because some of the components of what we need to do to bring aging under control have moved along far enough that people can see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of revenue, then yeah, a lot of things are moving very fast. But the whole approach of damage repair, which I've been pursuing all this time, is intrinsically, it's by definition a divide and conquer approach, and some of the components of that approach are considerably more difficult to implement than others. So the money that's coming in the private sector is very unevenly distributed. Basically, the hard parts are not investable, are not viewed as investable yet, and therefore the non-profit sector is still playing an absolutely indispensable role.
So, how do you balance being a fundraiser and a public figure with also being the one responsible for driving the science and the work forward?
I wouldn't really consider it a question of balance. I think they go together. I think the way that I succeed when I do, which is not often enough, in getting people to write me checks, is by getting them to trust me. And of course, that means they have to trust my integrity, but they also have to trust my expertise. So I think, the two things actually synergize rather well.
So, getting into the specifics of the work more now, like what are the most important projects and the work that you're doing right now?
Right. So I mentioned already that the more difficult components of this divide and conquer damage repair approach are still very much in need of further progress before they really become investable. That's not 100% true. There are some courageous investors who have gone into this, but there's not nearly enough of that going on. Like there are whole swathes that have like one company working on them. Um, uh, but yeah, so that's got to happen. So, for example, the accumulation of mutant mitochondrial DNA is something that hardly anyone's working on. There are definite, promising approaches, but they're not being pursued, and that needs to happen. They're not being pursued nearly well enough, anyway. However, the biggest thing which is missing from the private sector and which I am focusing on is the second phase that any divide and conquer approach has in anything, not just medicine. The two phases, of course, are first you build the components and then you put them together. Now, in typical engineering applications, the second part, the putting together, is the easy part. Once the bits work, once the bits are working, you can be pretty confident that the whole thing will work. But in medicine, it's not like that because we are seeking to manipulate this machine that we have a very, very poor understanding of, and therefore you can get plenty of surprises in phase two. So I've always been really eager to get into phase two as soon as possible, and I was finally able to start doing that about 3 years ago with LEV Foundation. Because what you need is some of the components to be actually working well enough that you can hypothesize at least that when you put them together they will have an additive benefit. And a few things had been made to work reasonably well. What I mean there is you take mice, which normally live 2.5 years, and you do nothing to them until they're in middle age, so until they're about 1.5 years old, and then you do something to them, and you try to make them live longer. And if they do, then that's promising. So we took four things that have that property, and we put them together, and it was reasonably effective. We did get an additive effect, but what we didn't get was a really big effect. The amount that you can get in terms of life extension of mice doing an experiment like that, where you start in middle age, already is like 4 months. You can turn the 2.5 lifespan into 2 years and 10 months. And the thing is, we've been able to do that for half a century. People could just feed mice less than they would like. That's called calorie restriction, and lo and behold, they live longer. And we understand why that is, because it's an evolutionary adaptation. It's not evolutionarily desirable or profitable to have offspring when there's a famine, because your offspring will die before they have their own offspring. And therefore, basically, the metabolic prioritization needs to shift into essentially hunkering down rather than growing quickly before you get eaten. Um, and this happens in all species pretty much. But the bad news is that it does not happen very significantly in long-lived species, simply because long famines don't happen often enough for evolution to really care about them. So it's a non-starter for humans. And and similarly, we have these drugs now which essentially trick the body into thinking it's in a famine when it isn't, and those are called CR mimetics. Very cool, I mean, people like eating, so if calorie restriction is going to have any benefit, then that's the way you want to try to do it. And that's all very well. It probably does marginally extend life, and certainly marginally extends healthy life. So I don't have any problem with these things, but they are not the holy grail. In our experiment, starting 3 years ago, we took one such drug, a calorie restriction mimetic called rapamycin, as a kind of positive control, and that got us what the same as it has got everyone else, 3 or 4 months of extra life. And then the other three interventions were damage repair of different types, and we put them together, and we got this additive effect. But as I say, we did not get through that 4-month glass ceiling. What did we learn from this? Well, I think what we learn is that we need to throw more things together at these mice. Now, as I mentioned, 3 years ago, we only had a few things that had been shown individually to have benefits. But the fantastic news is that during those 3 years, lots and lots of other things have come out. There's been a cascade of publications from various research groups showing life extension benefits starting late in life, as I mentioned, in other ways. So now we have a new study planned, which will involve 8 interventions. And in fact, we could do more than that if we really wanted to, but I think we can stop at 8 for the moment. Our problem, of course, is that these experiments are large. You can't just have a bunch of mice that you give a bunch of things to and then a bunch that you give nothing to, because if something doesn't work, you don't know why. So what you have to have is a lot of other treatment groups that get some but not all of the treatments. You don't need every single subset, every single combination, but you definitely need a treatment group that gets each of the things individually, just to kind of validate that we are recapitulating what other groups have found in the past. And you need groups that get all but one of the treatments, basically so as to identify antagonistic interactions where things cancel out in surprising ways. So yeah, it's basically going to be 2,000 mice. The first experiment was 1,000 mice, and that cost $3.5 million. And the next one's going to cost like $6 million. We found a few cost savings, but it's still, so we've got to find that money somehow.
Wow. So when it comes to that framework, like you were talking about earlier, of okay, we're not trying to slow down, we're actually trying to reverse damage here. What does a timeline look like? Because you use the example of like, okay, you're 60-year-old and you reverse to 40 years old biological. Like, what is the timeline to get those 20 years back, basically?
I think that well, of course, you can't say precisely because it's pioneering technology, but I think people like myself, the subject matter experts in this field, do have an obligation to make some kind of prediction. So the prediction that I always make is a probabilistic one. I say simply that I believe we have a 50% chance of reaching longevity escape velocity, getting those first 20 years, within the next 12 to 15 years from now, so in the latter part of the 2030s. Now, a lot of people would say that that's a ridiculously unrealistic um, timeline, simply because it takes 15 years to get one drug all the way through from discovery to approval, and indeed it does. But I have a one-word answer to that objection, and that one word is COVID. I absolutely claim that COVID is the single best thing that has happened to the longevity crusade this century. Essentially, what it did was it showed that when humanity actually puts its mind to it, it can get things done fast. In particular, vaccines. The COVID vaccine was developed and distributed globally in less than a year. And, previously, the fastest that had ever happened was 10 years, was more than 10 years. So it's literally a factor of 10 improvement, essentially because, humanity was not terribly keen on COVID and wanted it to be fixed and believed it could be fixed. And so governments around the world just threw away the entire rule book that they themselves had written at the public's behest, with regard to all the bureaucratic, regulatory obstacles and institutional inertia. They just said, get on with it. And if we look back, we can probably say, in fact, I think we can definitely say at this point that corners were cut, and some people died, and some people got sick as a result of that corner cutting. But the number of people who suffered as a result of that was a teeny, teeny, tiny fraction of the number of lives that were saved. And that's how we ought to be thinking in terms of medical progress. But it isn't how the medical profession normally works. The medical profession normally works based on this 3,000-year-old idea that of first do no harm. In other words, it doesn't matter how many lives you lose by doing nothing, which is completely crazy. And at last we have a precedent where that rule book, that dictum, was discarded, and masses of lives were saved as a result. So, so my current slogan is: we need to make aging the new COVID.
That's a great slogan that'll definitely get a lot of eyes. Um, do you get a lot of pushback on your work? And I don't like to use the word enemies, but like, do you think there are people out there who don't like the work that you're doing?
Well, not really. It, it appears that way sometimes. Certainly, when I first put forward the idea that multi-pronged damage repair was the way to go in the year 2000, virtually nobody in the field understood a word that I was saying. It was a really big paradigm shift. And it took a long time for me to, bang away and chip away at that skepticism. Um, some of it was quite acrimonious in the mid 2000s. But by the early 2010s, that was basically all over. I had completely won the argument. And sure enough, a few of my colleagues in 2013 put together a paper that was fundamentally a restatement of what I had said a decade earlier. And its time had come. So this paper was called The Hallmarks of Aging. It was published in one of the most prominent journals in the world, Cell. And it became very rapidly the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging this century by far, and it's definitely going to stay that way. so, so kind of nobody dislikes the science anymore. So what remains, of course, is that people do dislike the idea of tampering with aging. People, as I say, they tell themselves these fairy stories, and some of that comes down to being genuinely opposed to what they would call the medicalization of aging, which is it's unspeakable, it's ridiculous, but I'm just getting on with my job.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason why I asked that is from a healthcare medical system perspective. Like, we've built an entire medical system, it seems like, off of treating the effects of aging rather than simply aging itself. And I know you've talked about how, people see this as, okay, this is very complex work. This is hard, to the point of maybe even saying this is impossible, or you shouldn't concern themselves, or you shouldn't concern yourself with this. Like, so like I see that on one end, but on the other end, I kind of frankly just see it as, like, if we're talking about the medical system as a whole, just like, well, we just really don't care. And the reason why there's that lack of care is because, hey, we're making a lot of money built off of the system the way that it is now. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So this is something which, again, is, the people, the wrong people get the blame for this. So when I mentioned earlier on about COVID, people will often say it's appalling how long it takes to get a drug through the FDA. Um, and it is, but it's not the FDA's fault. The FDA is just implementing the law, so it's really the legislators' fault, except that it's not their fault either because they were elected. So it's the public's fault. The public are very risk averse. And that's why the whole first do no harm thing has stuck around for so much longer than it should have done. People just, when one person died in a clinical trial, there's uproar. And, whole swathes of medical research get closed down for a long time. This happened in 1999 with gene therapy. It's appalling how many lives will have been lost as a result of that. But that's what happened. Whereas, if lots and lots of people die as a result of the slow approval of this or that drug, then it doesn't make headlines. So, fundamentally, preventative medicine is the same thing. It's like people are very, very bad at reasoning with uncertainty. And when they're presented with the possibility of taking some medicine, some new medicine that's preventative, their thinking will be, well, there's a chance that this will make me sick, that it will not act as intended. Um, and even though the actual chance of it making them sick is infinitesimal, and the chance that it will postpone the time when they do get sick is large. Nevertheless, no, those numbers are not just, they don't factor into people's thinking. So what we end up with here is the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry in general, get a lot of flack from people in the longevity field, especially, for basically peddling sick care rather than health care. In other words, trying to keep people alive in a sick state of health because that's what makes them money, rather than stopping them from getting sick in the first place. And that is certainly what happens at the moment. But it's not because the pharmaceutical industry want it that way. It's because that's where the money is, that's where the demand is. If the public grew the fuck up and actually started to take preventative medicine seriously, then the medical industry would totally follow the money. It's not their fault.
It's a fascinating perspective. I like that. So where do you see those shifts? Like, if we're saying, like, on a micro level, if people are like, okay, I want to shift into that sort of preventative care type model, where do you see people like today taking that action?
Well, I mean, things are improving. Let's be clear. You've got a number of people in this field who are really pushing the preventative side of things. The flavor of the month right now is a guy named Brian Johnson, who is, quite controversial, and a lot of people think he's crazy. But maybe he is a bit crazy. But hey, maybe I'm a bit crazy. That's fine. The fact is, he's very, very sincere about what he does, and he's completely fearless about being laughed at and being criticised. So, he is a very wealthy guy. He made a lot of money with a company that created Venmo. Um, and he spends a lot of money on his health, but he talks about it a lot as well. And he's very passionate that prevention is the way to go. One thing that he's particularly passionate about is measurement. You can't prevent something that you might get unless you know what you might get. And so he has an MRI machine in his house. He does a lot of measurement, and he emphasizes that everybody should spend a significant amount of their time and money measuring themselves as much as possible. Blood work, everything like that, functional measures, so that where your weak links are, and you can determine what to prioritize. So, that's the kind of thing that is becoming more and more understood. You've got a number of other influencers saying the same kind of thing. Um, some of those influencers kind of make a bit of a mess of it by essentially emphasizing what we can already do today at the expense of emphasizing what we might be able to do in the near future. And that's a problem because there isn't honestly all that much we can do today. And it's very, very critical to, to put the pedal to the metal in terms of research to develop things that we don't have today. But by and large, things are improving in terms of the conversation, the general acceptability and legitimacy of prevention.
That's fascinating. So, are you saying that we have, or those influencers are put too much of an emphasis within this space on the present moment? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do that. Humanity does that across the board. Short-termism is kind of what we were evolved to prioritize, and thinking in the long term is hard.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, so if we had this conversation like 10 or 15 years ago, how would it differ compared to like what we're talking about today? Like, what were your main, I guess, philosophies and understandings and talking points back then?
It wouldn't differ all that much, to be honest. I mean, you can go and check. You can look at my TED talk, which was, let me say, 19 years ago. It's terrifyingly similar to what I say now. Um, of course, as I say, there are a few things that have changed. The emergence of the private sector with a lot more money does help, but these things do take time. I'm afraid, it takes time to change people's minds. Actually, let me give one example. So, one of the many people I met at TED who had the potential to make a difference to this world and who seemed to be pretty interested was a guy named Jeff Bezos, who was not nearly as wealthy back then as he is now, but he was wealthy enough. And he was really interested, and he would come up to me on his own initiative every year at TED for the next few years, and ask me, what's new, how's everything going, and he wanted to know details. Um, it took him 15 years to actually finally decide to pull his finger out and throw proper money at this problem in the form of $3 billion given to this company Altos. Um, you know, I do not know why it took him 15 years, but at least he did it eventually.
Wow. So you think, so like you were saying, that there's not much to do right now in the present moment, and going back to that timeline that you were talking about earlier with like late 30s. So you really think, or I guess like 50-50 chance you think late 30s, this really becomes like a present moment conversation?
Yes, in fact, actually, it'll become a present moment conversation quite a lot sooner than that, I believe. What I think is likely to happen is that within the next 5 years, maybe less, there will be a sufficiently dramatic amount of progress in the laboratory in mice, very possibly with the kind of experiments that we're doing at LEV Foundation, that the world will feel that it has permission to get its hopes up
Mm,
and not to engage in these fairy stories I was talking about. That will start with the subject matter experts basically seeing what's happened and starting to actually say the kind of things that I've been saying forever, namely to talk about time frame predictions. At the moment, as I say, I only give probabilistic time frame predictions, but at least I do that. Um, Almost all of my colleagues refuse to do that. They say, we don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. It's nonsense. It's just what they really don't want is to be accused of saying irresponsible things on camera, because that will be prejudicial to their next grant application. And, that's a terrible reason. But yes, that's going to change. And when it does, there will be a domino effect very rapidly. Essentially, influencers will start demanding a proper war on aging, demanding that we actually start treating aging like the new COVID. And as soon as people like Joe Rogan and, Mr. Beast and Oprah Winfrey start doing that, and they're already interested. I mean, I've been on Rogan twice. David Sinclair's been on Rogan a few times. George Church has, I think. Um, you know, as soon as that starts happening, the public will demand it too, and then it will happen. And so that's going to be, and there's going to be another 10 years, I reckon, from that point, before aging is properly brought under medical control in humans. Because the same things are not going to work. The same things that work in mice will not translate completely. There'll be a lot of work to be done, but it will be done, and it'll be done much faster than what's being done in standard medical research these days. During that time, there's going to be a lot of turbulence. Here's why. The main reason is that the global economy is built on people's expectation of how long they're going to live. The big ticket items that most people spend money on are things like health insurance, life insurance, inheritance arrangements, pensions. And, these things will have to be completely redesigned from the ground up when people transition from thinking they're going to live only a few years longer than their parents did into thinking they're going to live essentially indefinitely. And that will happen ridiculously suddenly, because the whole concept of longevity escape velocity is really not very hard to grasp when you try. And and people will just get it. And people had better be ready. So when I get the chance to give talks to pension funds or banks or whatever, um, the talk I give is typically entitled "Anticipate the Anticipation." In other words, the jobs of companies like that right now is to be preparing, to be developing new product lines, which they won't roll out until those product lines are ready, but they'll have them ready to go the moment this extraordinarily abrupt transition in human expectation actually occurs.
So, how does consciousness play into this? Because the way that I see it is like, okay, when we get to that point where the public and society really latches onto this, and from a consciousness perspective, we believe, okay, we're going to live much longer, and that happens on a mass scale. So it's like, the type of consciousness that we have right now, just about how aging is inevitable, and we just don't even think about it honestly. Like, it just kind of, mindlessly believe, we just take it as a natural perspective. Like, when the shift occurs into like what we're talking about today, like, how big of an impact is that on aging?
Well, I mean, that's a bit of a circular question. What you seem to be saying is, when we think we're not going to age, um, what impact will that have on whether we do age? It kind of won't. I mean, these things will go together. We will have a change in expectations as a result of progress that's being made. But maybe I'm not understanding the question right. I mean, the
I
main
guess
thing
just
is,
like the public buy-in, I guess, on a mass level. And I guess using the COVID, like you were saying, as an example of like, there was mass buy-in of like, hey, this is what we want and this is like what we believe in. And then just like using that same example for here.
yeah. So I mean, the simple way to say it is, I don't work on longevity. I work on health. Right? Longevity is a side effect of health, and um, nobody wants to be sick. Nobody thinks to themselves, okay, I don't want to be sick today, but it'll be fine to get sick when I'm 80. People don't think that either, right? Especially when they're 79. So, you know, it's not. It's the buy-in will be essentially universal, absolutely. And of course, that means that the buy-in at the level of implementation, government investments in infrastructure and medical personnel and so on, will also be, universal. So, we'll end up rather rapidly with a population that doesn't have any sick people to speak of. And that population will get progressively older. It will get older, I mean, chronologically older, right? Even though not biologically older. But that's fine. First of all, it will only happen at 1 year per year. So the problems that we often hear about today of dependency ratios, people having to work longer in order to support the elderly, that won't be true anymore because the elderly will not need support, and if you factor in also the rise of automation, then we will have, without doubt, a very, very different kind of global economy and career structure. You know, retirement ages are obviously under enormous pressure right now to go up because of what I just said, but that will go into reverse when automation eliminates half the jobs we have. And that's fine. At the moment, there hasn't been enough thought about how to rebuild an economy around that, around something that is not based on full employment. There's universal basic income, which is a very blunt instrument. There's going to be a lot of work to do to refine that. But that's how it's going to be. People are not going to be um, working all their lives. And there are many questions there about, how one gets one's self-esteem when it's not being obtained through a paycheck. But the time to actually start addressing and anticipating those changes is now.
I had Steven Kotler on my show a few months back. He's the co-founder of Flow Research Collective, and he does a lot of speaking on obviously flow state. And he said something really interesting. He said, if you want to be a popularizer of ideas, it's a very repetitive process where you're saying the same thing over and over because you're speaking to new audiences who are on a very base consumer level. Do you feel that to a certain degree when you speak and through your public work? Does it feel like, okay, I need to repeat myself all the time?
Oh, yes. In fact, it's even worse than what you just said. Absolutely, the name of the game is repeat advertising, and I always get the same questions and the same concerns, and so I'm always giving the same answers. But um, it's even worse simply because people don't want to hear the answers. People want to continue believing these fairy stories. And so even when I give an answer, it'll go in one ear and out the other. They'll change the subject. They won't come back with a rebuttal because there isn't one, but they'll just forget what I said. And so even if it's not a new audience, even if it's an old audience, they'll still have the same stupid fucking questions.
What are those typical questions and what are the typical fairy tales you're saying they're believing?
Oh, well, things like, oh dear, there will be an unacceptable number of people, because people will carry on being born and when they're not dying, we'll run out of space. Or, how will we pay the pensions? I just addressed that, with regard to, or, what dictators live forever. I mean, last I checked, dictator was fairly high on the league table of risky jobs. Not a lot of dictators die of aging in the first place. And the ones that do have organized their succession already. So, they're effectively immortal. And doesn't death give meaning to life? I mean, what can you say to that, right? I mean, it's just a completely content-free statement, but it's something that people will cling to in order to not listen to the idea that aging might actually be a bad thing.
I know another common question that I've heard you say you get a lot about is like, okay, what do you think your life is going to look like, down the line in the future? And it's kind of a rhetorical question or just it's a impossible question to answer because you have zero idea. But I am interested to know because you've said aging of the human body is very complicated and fixing it isn't going to happen overnight. As time goes on, we will get there. But the question is, how soon? Being future focused, like, do you believe like you yourself will be the one who sees this through for a very very long time, or do you view yourself as like I'm the one who's carrying the torch right now, so to speak, and it will be passed off?
Well, I mean, I have spent a lot of the reason why I do so much public speaking and so on is not just to educate the public, but to grow this community, to inspire people to get involved. And I've been pretty successful at that. I must say, I'm just as proud of my community building successes as I am of my scientific successes. So on the one hand, I wouldn't say it's a matter of passing the torch more so much as like lighting a lot more torches.
Mm.
So that's good. But in terms of what you were originally saying, I don't actually think very much into about how soon this is going to happen. As I say, I give these predictions, but I don't get emotionally invested in this because to me, I'm doing my best to hasten the defeat of aging, but if I ask myself, how much difference am I making? How much sooner is aging likely to be defeated than it would have been if I had not gone into this field in the first place? You know, it's hard to persuade myself that it's more than 10 years, right? And even if I regard myself as somewhere near the cusp of, either I will make it to longevity, escape velocity, or I won't, still, that may be a 10% difference either way, Um, it's not very exciting, 10%. Whereas if I think in terms of humanity in general, I don't know whose lives I'm saving. I don't know whether I've brought forward the defeat of aging from, 2040 to 2030 or from, 2140 to 2130. But either way, it's, a lot of lives. That's like 400 million lives, right? And I don't really need to care about which 400 million, you know. Even one day is 100,000 lives, that's quite easy to get out of bed for.
Aubrey, it's been incredible talking with you today. I really enjoyed the conversation. Where can people go to learn more about you, the work that you do, anything else you'd want to plug?
Well, naturally, we have a website, levf.org. I'm sure you will put it in the show notes. And everything's there, including a nice, friendly donate button. And of course, you can contact me directly. My email address is there. So, yeah, that's how to find out more.
Awesome. And I'm curious to know, like, are you the type of guy where like you just work all day and this like consumes you, or like are you able to turn off and on? Like, is there stuff like outside of this work that you really enjoy doing that gives you purpose?
I'm pretty good at turning off and on. I wouldn't say there's stuff outside of this that gives me purpose, but everyone needs a hobby, or to relax. I have a hot tub. I spend a lot of my time staring at the sky. You know,
Awesome. Yeah, it's been great talking with you today.
Thank you so much. Likewise.